Just about every major network and streaming service has at least one show that is a total misfire. That's especially the case on network TV, although even some of our favorite cable channels and streaming services occasionally produce a stinker. A lot of these horrifically bad shows were quickly cancelled, but some are actually still on the air right now. Let's take a look at the absolute worst show on every major network and streaming service, including Netflix, page 6, and HBO, page 9. We'll only be talking about current shows that have not yet officially ended or been cancelled. CBS 9JKL 9JKL. CBS 9JKL starts us off with a terrible title and goes downhill from there. This is by far the worst reviewed show on CBS right now, as it has a shockingly low Rotten Tomatoes score of 13%. Considering how many bad shows CBS has on at any given time, being the most terrible is almost an accomplishment. It premiered, The Daily Beast called this the worst sitcom nobody's watching. Crass, but not clever, and wallpapered with caricatures, stereotypes, and tired tropes, the series is getting the cold shoulder from viewers too, miffing the Big Bang Theory lead, and it was gifted for its debut, they wrote. Variety also called the show generally both bland and obvious. The critics aren't alone on this, as the show also has an IMDb score of just 4.8 out of 10. Next, this Fox musical show has a 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. Fox, Fox with star. It seemed pretty clear that Fox was hoping to replicate the success of Empire. It even comes from the same creator, Lee Daniels. But this musical is not nearly as well reviewed, with a score of 33% on Rotten Tomatoes. The critics' consensus reads, despite Queen Latifah's strong performance, Lee Daniels' star is weighed down by sloppy melodrama and overly cartoonish stereotypes. The Chicago Tribune explained in its review that the series is a combination of terrible TV movies and mediocre pop songs, and it suffers from stilted dialogue and a narrative so sloppy it overshadows the show's more redeeming qualities. Next, this NBC comedy doesn't quite work despite having a talented lead. NBC, Marlon. NBC doesn't have anything too egregiously awful on the air right now, at least not since it cancelled Taken. But compared to its other shows, Marlon has not received great reviews, as it holds a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. In his review for The Hollywood Reporter, Daniel Feinberg argued that the show's biggest issue is simply too much Marlon. In giving himself a vehicle that showcases a lot of the things he does very well, Wayans has made a family comedy in which the family contributes almost nothing and is consistently fading into the background behind an oversized lead performance, he wrote. Next, this ABC show managed to get a Rotten Tomatoes score of just 10%. ABC, Inhumans. ABC in March 2017, Netflix's Iron Fist left Marvel fans quite disappointed. But they had no idea how bad it could get. Later that year, ABC debuted Inhumans, by far the worst reviewed entry into the MCU to date. On Rotten Tomatoes, Inhumans holds an embarrassingly low score of 10%. This isn't one of those cases where critics dismissed a show but hardcore fans liked it. No, just about everyone seemed to hate this thing. But somehow, ABC hasn't cancelled it yet. Next, this recent CW series is one of the lowest rated shows on TV right now. The CW, Life Sentence. The CW starring Lucy Hale. Life Sentence follows a young woman who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer but who learns she is going to live after all. The show holds a 37% on Rotten Tomatoes, with the critics' consensus reading, Life Sentence avoids asking tough questions about serious issues, settling instead for a cloying sweetness. In a particularly negative review, the Boston Herald wrote that the show's humor is cringy, its dramatic moments rarely authentic. I'm hard-pressed to think of another show in recent memory that gave you so little reason to tune in the following week. Life Sentence struggled to find an audience right off the bat, and the ratings have been flat-out horrible ever since. The series' lowest-rated episode so far only drew 400,000 viewers. Next, this show on Netflix managed to get a Rotten Tomatoes score of 0%. Netflix, Real Rob. Netflix has its fair share of low-quality originals, from Iron Fist to Between. But by far the worst reviewed original show on the streaming service is Real Rob, which holds a rare 0% on Rotten Tomatoes. Rob Schneider stars in this series as himself, i.e. Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm. But the show has been criticized for being derivative and at times downright offensive. Common Sense Media said that the series is painfully unfunny and full of jaw-dropping stereotypes. Despite this, Netflix actually gave Real Rob a second season, which premiered 2 years after the first one. And according to Schneider's Twitter page, he's currently working on a third season that absolutely nobody asked for. Next, critics have called this Hulu show predictable and uninteresting. Hulu, freakish. Hulu doesn't have too many huge breakout shows outside of The Handmaid's Tale, but it also doesn't have many shows that are notoriously awful, but one of its least enjoyable is Freakish, a zombie show with a cast consisting largely of social media stars. It's more of a teen soap than a horror series, and Variety panned it by writing, the show never quite becomes interesting enough to transcend either the dully predictable beats of zombie horror or the plotting angst of young adulthood. Although Hulu doesn't release numbers, this would appear to be one of its least popular shows. Even on IMDb, the reviews lean negative. The show holds a score of 6.6 out of 10. Next, this Amazon original show isn't as successful as the property it's based on. Amazon, lore. Most of Amazon's current slate of shows receive fairly positive reviews, but the lowest rated series that it currently has is Lore, based on the popular podcast. It holds a score of 65% on Rotten Tomatoes, meaning this is another case where the series is simply the least good and not exactly the worst. Lore demonstrates why not all podcasts really work well on television. It mixes narration with reenactments, but the reenactments are never that compelling. We find ourselves just wanting to listen to the narration. In other words, we find ourselves wanting the podcast experience instead. Still, Lore was popular enough to earn a season 2, even as many of Amazon's shows were being cancelled. Next, this HBO show also came from a popular creator but received negative reviews. HBO, Here and Now. HBO more than almost anyone else, HBO is a network that doesn't tend to produce too many terrible shows. If it has a new original out, there's a solid chance it's going to be good, but of its current programs, one was a complete miss, Here and Now. Even though it comes from the mind of 6 Feet Under's Alan Ball, critics found this to be unfocused, trite, and flat-out boring. In a particularly scathing review, TV Line called Here and Now a crushing disappointment, an insufferably mopey family drama that's as dull and meaninglessly vague as its title. On Rotten Tomatoes, the show holds a score of 24%, making it one of the worst-reviewed HBO shows of all time. Next, despite coming from an acclaimed comedian, this Showtime show earned negative reviews. Showtime, I'm dying up here. Showtime Jim Carrey drew upon his own experiences for the Showtime series, I'm Dying Up Here, which is about the stand-up comedy scene in the 1970s, but the show received mixed reviews, earning a score of 51% on Rotten Tomatoes. The critics' consensus reads, while I'm Dying Up Here hints at untapped potential and deserves praise for authentic period detail, its attempts at affecting drama are undermined by subpar writing and a muddled focus. The Variety review for the show noted that it doesn't really have anything interesting to contribute to the ever-growing genre of shows about comedians. The publication wrote, this series spends a lot of time on truths that are fairly well known, i.e., that stand-ups are generally damaged, difficult people who have trouble with intimacy and both cheer and envy the success of their peers. But the show doesn't spend quite enough time and effort on the kind of deeply textured character development that would allow it to stand out in the crowd. Next, even though this show is the worst on its network, it's still not that bad. FX, Snowfall. FX is one of those networks where you can expect the vast majority of its shows to meet a certain standard of quality. Right now, it doesn't have anything on the air that is downright awful. But the current FX show that has received the most mixed reviews is Snowfall, the first season of which earned a score of 61% on Rotten Tomatoes. In his review for Uproxx, Alan Sepinwall argued the series is cliché and poorly paced, noting that it oddly feels sluggish and rushed at the same time. Snowfall will be returning for a second season, though, which could potentially be an improvement. Next, this AMC show earned a score of 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. AMC, The Sun. AMC. Not too long ago, AMC was on top of the world with two of the greatest shows ever, Mad Men and Breaking Bad, airing on the network at the same time. These days, its slate is not nearly as prestigious, although it does have some solid shows. But the series on the network that critics were not super into was The Sun, which earned a score of 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. The Rotten Tomatoes consensus declared that the show is bogged down by sluggish pacing, hasty direction, and superficial execution. This was a case where most critics didn't really find the show to be spectacularly bad, it was just really nothing special or worth recommending. Next, this comedy show often has great guest stars in it, but the series isn't as funny as it could be. TBS, The Guest Book. TBS doesn't have any shows on the air right now that are really that bad. But the show that critics consider to be the least good is The Guest Book. Every episode of this comedy focuses on different vacationers staying at a rental cottage. The first season earned a 64% on Rotten Tomatoes. Both the positive and negative reviews tended to agree that the show is a mixed bag with plenty of highs and lows. Variety argued that it lacks jokes that land, which is a problem, considering this is a more conventional single-camera comedy that more openly promises laughs. It rarely delivers. Next, this show is based on one of the most popular superheroes of all time, so why isn't it a hit? SciFi, Krypton. SciFi Krypton is yet another superhero TV series, but it's unfortunately not one of the better ones. It takes place on Superman's homeworld 200 years before his birth, with the main character being Seg-El, Superman's grandfather. Critics' reviews have been mixed, with the show earning a 60% on Rotten Tomatoes. The critics' consensus reads, Krypton's eccentricity declines into silliness with a dull narrative that fails to fulfill a promising premise. In general, critics felt the show suffers from a number of problems, not the least of which was the fact that delving this far into Superman's backstory just isn't that enthralling. The Hollywood Reporter wrote, any series that looks and feels, at least 50% of the time, like a spoof is already in a pretty bad spot. But if that series gives off the vibe that the characters inside it look completely uninspired, then you have a whopper of a problem. Next, this show is so bad that it's not even clear if the network is still going to air it. Paramount Network. Heathers. Paramount Network, formerly Spike, has not even aired Heathers yet. It was delayed in the aftermath of the Parkland school shooting. But the pilot was made available online for long enough for viewers to see how terrible this reboot is. The show holds a 33% on Rotten Tomatoes, with The Hollywood Reporter arguing that it's a one-note disappointment, taking certain surface-level detours from the movie and adding precious little scathing insight of its own. Others hated it even more. Birth Movies. Death called it a hateful, bigoted exercise in regression hiding behind the guise of dark comedy. It's not even clear when or if Paramount is actually going to air Heathers. But based on the reception it has received, scrapping it entirely might be for the best. Check out the cheat sheet.